I'm George Roby. I'm retired from the U.S. Forest Service. I retired as the Supervisor of the Angeles National Forest. I was born in Chicago. My dad worked for the railroad, and then I moved to Kansas City when I was 6 months old. He worked in aircraft there, and then from there I moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Went to high school in Tulsa and graduated in 1958 and wanted to come west to find a good job somewhere. My dad had transferred to Palmdale and went to work for Convair, Lockheed, and they were a pretty good place to work. So I came from Tulsa right after graduation and went out there and applied for work. They weren't hiring, so I went to junior college in the meantime while I was looking for work. And in my path to the Forest Service was probably more unique than any one I've ever known, and that's why I'm going to explain this. I was in junior college in Lancaster, Antelope Valley Junior College, and in chemistry class, a gentleman sitting next to me, we were doing an experiment, distilling mercury, and he wasn't following the instructions. And I looked over at his experiment, and it was about ready to blow. And I yelled at him, and I said, "Hey, shut that off." That's the instructions said, turn the Bunsen burner off. And so it exploded in my face. And so I was fighting mad. I couldn't see. It blinded me. And he apologized, but I wasn't ready for an apology. So the instructor throws me out in the backyard and starts dousing me with a garden hose. We didn't have a wash down station or anything in those days. And he comes out, and I told him if I could see him, I would punch him right in the mouth. And he felt real bad about it, and I felt bad about it. And then I was gone for 2 or 3 days, going to the doctor and hospital, and got my eyesight back fine and got back to class. And Dave apologized to me and said, "George," he says, "I understand you're looking for a job." And I said, "Yeah, I am looking for a job." He said, "Well, my dad is district ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, and I work for the Forest Service on the San Bernardino, and he's on the Angeles." He said, "I bet he'd hire you. You look like you'd be a good employee." And so I said, "Well, boy, I'll do it." So that weekend I run out there to the ranger station, and they had filled all their fire positions. He said they'll have a fire position maybe for me. And so he said, "I'm sorry, I don't have any positions open now, but I do have a lifeguard job, and I can't find a lifeguard anywhere." And I told him that I was a lifeguard. And he didn't believe me, and he says, "Show me your card," because I had told him there was nothing I couldn't do with tools and, hard work on farms and stuff in Oklahoma. And he said, you tell me you're also a lifeguard?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Show me your card." So I reached in my wallet real quick, thumbed in there, hoping I could find it. And I didn't know whether I even had it in there anymore. And I pulled it out, and I had 2 years currency on the card. And he hired me as a lifeguard for the Forest Service. And then at the end of the summer, a firefighter job opened up, and they didn't need lifeguards after that, so they immediately put me on a fire crew, and I've been with the Forest Service ever since. 31 years later, I retired on the Angeles as supervisor. I was lifeguarding at Little Rock Reservoir out over by Palmdale, Little Rock on the desert side, and Jackson Lake up in the Angeles high country. So I would rotate between the two lakes on the other lifeguards' days off. And then they also had a lifeguard on the front side of the Angeles, which was Crystal Lake on the Baldy district. So that they've been shut down for years. They haven't had lifeguards for years. But that got me in that got my foot in the door of the Forest Service. While I was on the Angeles as a technician, I filled several jobs: firefighter, a tank truck operator, engineer today, and a fire prevention technician. And while I was a fire prevention technician in the high country of the Angeles, the ranger called me one day, Mr. Beardsley, the one that hired me, and said, "George, the forest supervisor is coming up wants to see the high country. Let's meet him there, and I'll introduce you to him." And so the forest supervisor, his name was Sim Jarvie, came up, met at my ranger station. We had lunch over the hood of my truck, and we start talking, and Sim Jarvie, the forest supervisor, said, "Mr. Roby, I understand, talking with Ranger Beardsley here, you're interested in working for the Forest Service as a career." And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, are you going to college?" And I said, "Well, I've thought about it, but I haven't done anything with it yet." And he said, "I would recommend you get a degree in college. From what I'm hearing, you could do well with this organization." And that was from the forest supervisor, and the ranger is sitting there listening to all this, and he said, "There's a lot of good schools in the West that you could go to, but there's one in particular." And the forest supervisor said, "I went to Oregon State, and that's the school I would recommend." The ranger went to Berkeley, and the ranger said, "No, I would recommend Berkeley, George." He said, "That's a great school, and it's closer, and you're no out-of-state tuition." And the forest supervisor said, "Beardsley, is there a school in Berkeley?" And that became a personal joke between the two of us, and I eventually got accepted and went to Oregon State. And in my first class, forestry orientation, the professor asked us all where we were from, if we had any experience in the Forest Service. And I told him I worked on the Angeles, for 2 or 3 years. And he said, "Did you know a Sim Jarvie?" And I said, "Yes, I did. And he's why I'm here." And he says, "He's the best student I've ever had, and I've followed his career all the way. He's now supervisor on the Angeles National Forest." And I said, "That's right." So that was quite a roundabout way to say how I wound up at Oregon State. The person that probably has impacted my career the most is a gentleman named Don Beetle. Don was a foreman on the Valyermo engine over on the desert side of the Angeles, and I became a crewman under him. My first year as a crewman is when I went to work for him. The second year, he asked me to become his TTO, his driver, and his engineer today. And Beetle was known all over the United States as one of the best fire behavior specialists and line personnel, and he was used as a consultant in many, many incidents. And he pounded on me, and I mean pounded, that he said, "You need to go to college." He said, "You need to go to college. You have real potential with this organization." And he said, "I wish I had done that. I didn't. And look where I am. I'm still an engine captain." Well, I thought an engine captain was a great job. I would have been happy with being an engine captain at that time. And so after pounding and pounding, and then he, of course, reported to Charlie Beardsley. And Charlie Beardsley had some feelings, and he and Don had gotten together, and that's what led to the meeting with the forest supervisor in the high country of the Angeles. Well, Don Beetle actually is the one that started that and carried the message to the district ranger, and then the district ranger then carried the message to the forest supervisor that they should support me for going to college. And so they let me take leave of absence. I was already a full-time employee, by the way, at the time. So they gave me leave of absence, and I went to Oregon State, and they even helped carry my insurance for me while I was going to school. And Don Beetle started that whole chain of command and followed him till his death. So he was an impact in my life, even well into my full career. There was a professor in our dendrology class that was quite a jewel. He taught dendrology. He was the toughest professor on campus. He tried to flunk you. In fact, told us that half of you in this class, I won't see you next year. You'll be gone. And so he was tough. And in one of the exams he gave us, I got 100% on a identification class where you put needles, cones, different characteristics of different types of trees on tables, and you had to write down by just looking at whatever that was and identify, what tree it was or shrub. And I was the only one that got 100% on the class. And he had given me a couple of F's before this because I had to really knuckle down and study because he was right. He's going to flunk everybody. So I studied for this, and the one that puzzled him that I got was the big cone Douglas fir cone laying on the table, because that's not a tree that's in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm the only one that got it. And on the Angeles, it's one of the largest stands of big cone Douglas fir in the world, and in fact, it is the biggest. So I was around big cone Doug fir all the time. And then when I saw the Douglas fir up in Oregon and Washington, I said, boy, that's a tiny, insignificant little cone. And so that was something that he really remembered me by. And from then on, there was nothing I could do wrong for that professor. He had me help him on classes and everything else. So it was quite a turnaround when I was flunking out for a while. Well, meeting my wife on a blind date was a significant event in my life. I had been a single person for a long time, and when I was junior forester on the Tujunga district of the Angeles, I got a date with her on a blind date, and found out she was from Costa Rica, and she had come up here to go to college. And she went to business college in Santa Monica and went to work from there at the Bank of America. And my boss, the ranger I worked for, his wife also worked there and knew her. And so when I was trying to get a date for this big bash in San Fernando Valley, the Elks Club Hawaiian Luau, the date that I had a death in the family and had to cancel right at the last minute. And so I told him I can't go. And the ranger said, "You're going, I'm going to get you a date. Would you take a blind date?" And I said, "Sure, I want to go to that luau." And so I met Margarita, and her last name was Scott, Margarita Scott. And so when I walked up to the door to pick her up for the date, I asked her, she came to the door, and I says, "I'm here to see Margarita Scott." And she looked at me and said, "I'm Margarita Scott." And I was shocked because she was a pretty lady, and I was expecting the worst, and she was too, I found out later. But so 2 years later we got married, and we've got a wonderful family, and that was one outside experience that really changed my life. Wow. Well, I filled just about every job there is in fire, from engine crewman, engineer, captain. I've worked on the Angeles 4 different times, and the Cleveland, the San Bernardino, the Los Padres, and the Shasta Trinity National Forests. And I've been district ranger on the Angeles before I became supervisor. And the ICS experience was a great one. When I was ranger on the Angeles, this is the time the ICS was born in 1970, came out of the Nassau program, and we were being trained in ICS throughout the Forest Service in Southern California only. We were the only ones to pilot the program at that time. And there was reluctance for people to want to use the new terminology in ICS. So we would start a fire under the large fire organization, the old fire system. And then during the incident, we would swap positions and names and titles, and it just confused the hell out of everybody. So once we had an organization going, the trend was, okay, now we'll change to ICS. So we fought that because there was tremendous issues when you did that, confusion with operational plans and everything else that are involved. So we started pushing the region to allow us to, the next big fire that happens anywhere in Southern California, that we start as ICS. And so the fire team I was on the Angeles was the first team to be on a full incident command fire, and that was the Pacoima fire on the Angeles in 1974. And so we started from the beginning and went through the incident, finished under ICS, and everything went relatively well. We had no major issues that we didn't have when we made the start with the large fire organization. So we became the first full-blown ICS fire on the Angeles at that time. And I was a planning section chief on the team at the time. And then later, I transferred as fire chief of the San Bernardino National Forest, and my team became incident commander on a Type 1 team, and we were the second team, I think, to be fully qualified under ICS. And so I was sort of in the beginning of the development of ICS, went through the first incident, and later became a Type 1 incident commander under the ICS system, along with many other people. Well, the major changes took place when we shifted to ICS. The biggest, in my opinion, that we felt at first was common communications. The vocabulary became the same. Positions became the same, no matter whether you were LA County, CDF, now CAL FIRE, but CDF, or Forest Service. Everyone knew what an engineer was. Everyone knew what an engine was, because the Forest Service called them tankers, others called them engines. And so it became a major communications issue under the LFO, the Large Fire Organization. And so one of the major improvements, a very simple one, was clear text and common terminology. And I think that in itself, if that's all that ever came out of it, would have been a major, major improvement. And now it's recognized worldwide. I taught ICS in the Dominican Republic, Argentina, a lot of Southern America countries teaching ICS after I got into D.C. in Washington when I worked there. I haven't gotten to that point yet. That's quite an experience that I've had there. I was in D.C. in that fire staff job in Washington, and on a Sunday night, there's about 2 feet of snow outside. We had just moved into the house. I get a call from Al West, the fire director, national fire director in Washington, saying, Roby, are you available to go to the Dominican Republic for a forest fire? They want an incident commander that's knowledgeable of Spanish and the Latin sector. And they knew I'd been married to Margarita for 25 or 30 years and been to Costa Rica for 10 or 20 times. And he said, I know you're familiar with the culture and everything. Would you be interested in taking that assignment? They want a full fire team. And they want a Spanish-speaking fire team. And I said, well, yeah, I'd be happy to, And of course, I didn't speak Spanish, but I knew the culture, and I do speak some Spanish, very little. So he said, we'd like to have you pull together a full fire team and meet in the Dominican Republic. They have a major fire. It's threatening their major communication systems for the entire country, and they're afraid they're going to lose it. And I said, okay. So Boise, the fire center in Boise, started pulling together different key positions that spoke Spanish off different teams, and I was going to be the instant commander. And so I got the word that the team is together. We had 8 or 10 people. It was a short team, and they were all going to airports and getting ready to meet me in the Dominican and Santiago. And so I said, well, wait a minute, I don't have a passport. I just all of a sudden hit me. I hadn't gotten a passport yet when I just transferred to D.C. And he said, oh, you don't have one? So he calls the chief's office, and the chief says, don't worry, we'll get him there. And so they wrote a letter, and that letter was waiting for me at the Miami airport. I left D.C., landed in Miami to catch a connection to Santiago, and they were, when I got to the airline desk in Santiago, in Miami, here's a letter with my name on it, sealed envelope, and I pick it up, and it's a letter from the chief of the Forest Service saying George Roby is coming under the direction of the AID, and please allow him access into the country and into the Dominican. He's there to help you suppress the fire. And so I got in that way without a passport or a visa or anything. But I wasn't sure I was ever going to get back. That was the problem. And so anyway, they told me that the U.S. had had a bad experience in the Dominican when the Marines took over there when they were having a coup, and the Marines were sent in there to make peace in the Dominican. They had a very bad taste about the U.S. and the Marines at that time. And they said, you're not going to get a very good reception. Be prepared. But the director of AID wants you there. So all the time, all the team members are getting to airports and things. I land in the Dominican. And so as I walk off the airplane on a stairway, it wasn't a jetway, and they said, well, wear a full Forest Service uniform because the general won't talk to you if you don't. He doesn't want a gringo running his fire. And so they warned me that it's going to be a real experience. So on the plane flying down there, I said, I'm going to find some positive things that they're doing there before I make one recommendation. So I jotted down a bunch of things I could think about that I could make a positive comment about what they're doing on this fire. They had 700 people on the fire, 700 military and 200 civilians. So I jot down 10 or 12 things that I was going to say positively about what I saw, even though I wasn't sure what I was going to see. So I land at the airport, and there's 2 gentlemen in suits standing at the base of the stairs. And they're all, as people are coming down those stairs, every man that would come down, they Senior Roby, and they'd all say no. And finally I came out of the door, and of course I was in uniform. And so they eventually saw where I was, but I could hear them asking these people if I was Senior Roby. And if they were Senior Roby. So I finally get down and I wave. I said, I'm Senior Roby, So I get down. They grab me by the arm. I had a small carry-on, a small briefcase, and they rushed me out of the line that were walking to the terminal into a single door into the side of the terminal on the first floor. And they said, come in here. I said, well, what about my luggage? And don't worry, it's taken care of. So somebody got my luggage. I wasn't sure if it was ever going to show up. So I get in, and here's this command room with a big table, and everybody sitting around the table, military. And they've got radios going and a map with the fire on it. And they say, how many people do you have coming? I said, I've got about 8 or 10. I couldn't remember at the time, and what total they were able to get for the team. And he said, really? And he said, well, the general just called us and told us he has it under control. And I said, well, I just flew over the fire coming into the Santiago airport, and if he's got it under control, it's a big surprise to me because I saw heads burning everywhere in every direction in the canyons. And I said, really? He says, well, so they get on the radio, and the military guys with these big radios and standing there and talking to the general and said, are you sure? The gringo says it's burning pretty good. And no, I've got it. I don't, tell him to go home. And so the director of AID, who was sitting in there with me, he met me at the airport. He said, well, let's talk about this now. Let's see where we're at. Because he was trying to make a good impression on the Dominican, because their U.S. was not in very good stand with anybody there. And so he said, I think we need to think about this before we send anybody home. And so the director of the military that was there in the room, not the general, I don't know what his rank was, he said, well, wait a minute, can we turn the other people around? Is it too late? So they interpreted that to me, and the director of AID said, is it too late to turn them around? I said, I don't know. I hate to turn them around, but we might be able to. So the answer was, turn them around. We'll let you stay as an instant commander, but turn the team around because the general doesn't need any help. I said, well, that surprises me with what I see on the ground. So it wasn't 2 seconds, and there's a telephone sitting in front of me to call Boise to turn everybody around. So I called the fire center in Boise and told them the story, and they had busted their buns to get these people together, all Spanish speaking. And so I said, hey, here's the word. We got to cancel that order. Can you do that? And if they happen to get here, we'll just turn them around. That's all we can do. So he was able to turn them all around before they got in Miami or before. So all the team turned around, and I stayed. And so then they started asking me, will you go out and meet with the general tomorrow in the daylight? It was dark by then. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to. So I kept my full uniform on. Excuse me, so I'd be dressed somewhat like the general. And I had him pegged as being an image of Castro in my mind as I'm flying down there. So I had him pictured as a Castro-looking person. And sure enough, when I got to the instant command post on the fire where he was, and on the way I was in a helicopter, military helicopter, and I was able to recon the fire going into the helispot, so I could see the fire again, and it by no means was contained. So I landed. They drive me to in a Jeep, and it says diplomat on the license plate from the State Department, and drive me all the way into the command post. And here's the general waiting for me on the front porch, full uniform, and he looked just like Castro. He was about 6'3", 6'4", and big man, and he had 8 or 10 18-year-olds around him with AK-47s. Like bees right around his body. And so here he sees me getting out of the Jeep and walking toward the command post, and he's standing there and reaches out, shakes my hand, and I say hello to him, and we do a few little gyrations together, and a little bit of English and a little bit of Spanish, and then he says, come in. So we walk into the command post, and here's a big map on the wall and shows the fire. And I saw a lot of it as I was able to recon it coming in. And he says, this is the fire. And I said, wow, you've really got some rugged terrain here. I was amazed. It looks a lot like the Sierras. And he said, oh, yeah, really? And I said, yeah. And he said, he says, how are we doing? And I said, well, I don't know. It looked like they were doing okay. He said, I saw a crew looking like they were burning out on one of the dog legs down there, and it looked like it was working real well. And he said, yeah. He said, we sent 2 or 3 people to the United States to get training. And I said, when did you do that? And he said, oh, about 20 years ago. And they had all retired, but he told me that they had the training. So anyway, after we talked a while, he was still very cold to me, didn't want to have anything to do with me, and pretty well said that you can go home anytime. And so after I had asked him several questions and said, hey, that's great, that's really good record. I said, how many people have you injured on this fire? It's real steep. He says, 0. And he goes, 0. And I said, really? I said, wow, that's great. On a fire like this, with this size and this terrain, we'd have had injuries in the United States of some kind. Then he puffs up and he hits his little entourage of AK-47s and looks at him and says, see, I'm showing that he really knows what he's doing. And so after about 5 or 6 positive statements, he started eating out of my hand. He started asking me advice. And I didn't even get to my list of 12. And so all of a sudden he says, are you hungry? And I says, yeah, a little bit. I had breakfast, but he said, oh, good. And he sends one of his little entourage off to a warehouse or somewhere and gets some old sea rations from the 60s when the Marines were down there on the coup that they had left. So they had been sitting there since the 60s and in this little warehouse of his. And so they handed me that, and I opened it up, and the first can I bring out is puffed. It's definitely bad. And I told the general, I said, malo, bad, malo. And he goes, no, we eat them all the time. I said, let me show you something. So what he was doing is seeing if I knew how to open a can with the P38 opener that comes in the C-Rat can. So I said, watch. And so I walk out to the front porch of the command center and I hold the can like that, and I put the P38 into it, and it spewed for 20, 30 feet out off the porch. And he goes, oh my God. And he looks around at all of his little entourage and says, ooh, Milo. And I said, yeah, that's a bad sea ration. And so that started a positive relationship when he knew what he was testing me on, they told me later, was if I knew how to use one of those military can openers, and which I had many, many times. So he puts me in his Jeep, and we start reconning the fire. He takes me out. So before you know it, he was asking me advice on everything. So as we contained the fire finally, we saved the electronic site that they were worried about. It was an electronic site on the top of the mountain that was the complete communication system for the country and for the military. And so they were afraid the fire was going to take this electronic site out, and it could have done that very well. But we were able to contain it and get it down to be safe, and got it contained and saved their electronic sites. So anyway, so to make a long story short, I got sent back. I was there 10 days with the general, showing him how to fight fire basically, and what they were doing right and what they were doing wrong. And so then I get sent back to Santiago to the AID office to get ready to go home when the hip fire was out and contained. So the director of AID says, George, any chance of you staying? The president wants to meet with you. And I'm just shocked, because I already had reservations to leave the next day to come back to D.C. So I said, well, I have to get approval from Washington because I've already got my flight instructions and everything else. And so they called the AID office in the State Department in Washington and told them we'd like to have Mr. Roby stay for another day or two because the president wants to meet with him, and we want him to write a complete report on what he found when he got down here about firefighting capability of the Dominican. So I got word from the chief's office to go ahead and stay as long as you're needed down there. So I had to make new arrangements and everything for the flight home. So I write a report, and as I'm writing the report, I get a phone call at the hotel. the president's ready to meet with you. So they picked me up in a limo, drove me to the presidential palace, and I walk in, and it was like walking into a plush gold and silver castle. And here's one of the poorest countries in the world, and the president's living in gold and silver. And so I was amazed when I got into the building, and they say, okay, you're going to have 15 minutes max with the president. I said, okay. So the director of AID is with me as my interpreter. And so we wait, and sure enough, the door opens, and they call me in. And the president looks at me, and I was still in uniform. He looks at me and he says, Mr. Roby, I've heard good things about you. And he said, that's unusual here for a gringo to be spoken about positively. So he said, but I hear good things that have happened there, and I want to get some advice to you on how good my military fought fire. And I said, oh boy, here we go, So I was honest with him, and I told him the limitations and the training they need and all that. And so I took a notebook, and I drew out an incident command system on a piece of paper for them that fit their situation, because they had civilian Forest Service there and military, and they were all operating under two different plans. So I told them the issue and gave them a complete rundown on incident command. And that 15 minutes turned into be 2 hours. And so after I drew out these drawings and things they could do to improve their organization, he says, can you come back and train all of our people? I said, oh, you have to clear that with the chief. The chief's got to approve that. So anyway, after a very positive press, which evidently the director of AID is, after I finished my report, the director of AID brought me a whole stack of newspapers from the Dominican cities in the Dominican, and they were all positive about the gringo. He said, George, we don't see this ever here. He said, this is one of the first times we've ever gotten positive press in these newspapers. So you made quite an impression on the country. And I said, wow, that's quite a, you really make me feel good about this. And he said, well, you should. So I was really feeling good. And so I get home. They finally get me to the airport and get me to the D.C. And so when I left, I was to come back at a mutual time to train their people in the incident command system and show them how to fight fire with fire behavior and all that. Well, I get a call from AID about a week after I got home, as we were negotiating on when I might go back, and they said, no, we've decided we're not going to do it in the Dominican. There are other countries, Spanish-speaking countries, that need the same help in South America and Central America. So we're going to set up a seminar at Marana, in Marana, to train South American countries on fighting fire. And we want you to coordinate the training. And we already have 10 or 15 countries that are interested in doing it. So let's get started on this. So that was one of the big projects I did. So we brought 22 or 23 countries, 4 or 5 from the country, into Marana and trained them in the incident command system and fire behavior. And it turned out to be probably one of the most positive experiences I've had in the Forest Service. And I still get communications for some of the people we trained in those countries, even today. This was 1982, I think. Yeah, it was either 81 or 82. I just transferred to D.C., and my father had just died, so that's pretty much the time it would have been. All of those people came to Marana and trained in our facility, gotcha. Forest Service facility in Marana, which has now been transferred to Tucson, downtown Tucson. Yeah, it would have been 1969. I was the battalion chief for the Forest Service on the Cleveland National Forest, out of Descanso, California, and I get a call from the Los Padres district ranger in the Los Padres asking me to apply for a job on the Ojai district on the Los Padres. It would have been a promotion for me, so I really considered it heavily, and but it wouldn't be in fire. So they need a manager for the oil field on the Ojai district, one of the biggest producing oil fields on Forest Service land in the United States at the time. And so I sort of got interested in it. And of course, I knew Ojai was a real jewel to live, but another high cost of living area. So we decided that we were going to apply for it. So I apply, and I get the job, and I go up there, and I'm all of a sudden now I'm managing an oil field, going to Oregon State and Forestry. That was one of the farthest things from my mind that I would ever be involved in. So I knew nothing about oil production and drilling and all this thing. So I started getting familiar with the oil business, and I had 4 major oil companies operating in this field. And every well required a road, pipeline, water line, oil line, gas line, power line, telephone line to a well pad. So it was a major impact on the land. And so we managed the surface, and the Department of Interior managed the subsurface, oil and gas. So I had to deal with the Department of Interior on everything. And so after 2 or 3, 4 months of me training myself, I lived in the oil museum in Santa Paula. Union has a big oil museum that goes back from the history of oil in California all the way to the present. So I learned a lot about the industry in this museum. And the curator of the museum was very helpful, and he was a petroleum engineer and taught me a lot. And I had to learn fast because they were pulling the wool over my eyes, and I knew it out there on the ground. So as I learned more, the other challenge with this one is the Sespe oil field is in the middle of the California Condor Sanctuary, which is a major conflict. And so it's surrounded by the Condor Sanctuary, this oil field. So a lot of environmental concerns. So anyway, I start learning the business a little bit and saying to myself time after time, why didn't they say something about this at Oregon State, you know? And so the oil fields started to get out of control, and they announced 65 new wells planned for the next 3 or 4 years. And I said, oh my God, what an impact. And everyone required a road, a drilling pad, sumps to store the oil material that they were using to produce, and natural gas tanks, you name it. It was a major impact for a well. And so I was driving to Santa Barbara, from Ojai to Santa Barbara, and I saw these drilling platforms out in the Pacific. And I saw it looked like multiple pumps, oil derricks out there on the pumping units out on these platforms. And I said, well, that's interesting. How in the hell are they putting 10 or 15 wells on that platform and going to different parts of the formation? So I started asking the oil people about it, and they said, oh, they're doing indirect drilling. They'll put 15 or 20 pumping units on one platform out there and go to different parts of the formation that produces oil from one site, because it's too expensive to put in all these platforms out there and on and on and on. And I said, wow, why can't we do that on the ground? To myself. So I go back and talk to my ranger, and I said, you know, they're doing it out here on the in the Pacific out here, between here and the Channel Islands. Why can't we do it here in the Sespe oil field and have one drilling pad and put multiple wells on that pad and not have to have another road and another pipeline, power line, telephone line? And so Al West at the time said, you know, that is He goes, why in hell didn't I think of that? And so all of a sudden, we're going in a different direction, and I start talking to the oil companies. And every one of those roads and pipelines and power lines required a special use permit. So it's a lot of work. And so I went and met with the oil companies in Fillmore, California, at a restaurant down there. And I told them what I'm thinking, and they said, oh, you young punk kid, you don't know what the hell that's completely out of the question in this kind of terrain. It's too steep, and on and on and on. And I said, well, it's too steep, all right. And it's too steep for putting 60 well pads in instead of maybe 10 or 8. And so when they saw that I was really serious and that my ranger was going to back me up, the wheels started turning. And so after several meetings with Shell, it was, West States Oil Company, West States, coffee shop in Fillmore, California, where we always met. I said, the next series of wells you want in this section of the oil field, we're going to do it from one well pad. It'd be bigger well pad, but less impact on the land. And so sure enough, they reluctantly agreed. They told me that's going to cost a lot more money. It's going to, you don't know what you're doing to our budget. You're being unreasonable. I said, well, I think we're being unreasonable on the land right now. And the erosion was terrible in that area. So they started the first drilling island, they called it. And they put, I think, 10 wells in that one spot. And all of a sudden, one day, the president of West States called me and met in Fillmore down at the cafe. He says, George, guess what? What we're doing up there now that you forced us to do, I was expecting a big load of you-know-what, right? Telling me how screwed up I was. He says, we're saving money. It's cheaper for us to do what we're doing there. So we're going to do drilling islands from now on. We're not going to do individual well pads. So we made an impact there. And the ranger, after we started getting several of these, started working with the lands and minerals people in the regional office. They handle oil and gas leases. And so I worked with them a lot. They asked me to write the manual on oil field management on national forest land. So Al West and I actually, pretty much the two of us wrote the manual for how to produce oil on national forest land, especially in California. So that was a major a job and accomplishment that we made there that had nothing to do with being a forester. It turned out it really did, because of erosion, watershed management, all the other things I learned in Oregon State paid off there. And so it's still a producing oil field today. It goes up and down. And they also frack there. That's where the fracking first started for secondary recovery on. And so when they get the oil, easy oil, then they start fracking. And fracking is something that's become very controversial around the United States. It's actually a short for fracturing. And so I learned all about fracturing and how they do it and all the ramifications of producing secondary and primary production in oil fields. And for years I'd get calls from the regional office after I left the Ojai. Hey, what about, George, what would you recommend on this thing going on in the oil field? Guys that replaced me on the job. That's when I went to Ranger, back to Ranger on the Angeles. So that's my oil field story. Let me make another story about that one. When we were doing that first drilling island on Oat Mountain, it's a real narrow, full cut road all the way to the top. And so as I'm going up, I was also on the condor identification team on the forest. I did all the condor surveys when they had them. We'd learned how to identify them and distinguish them from golden eagles and bald eagles and turkey vultures and all the birds that fly around this country. So as I was coming up on this switchback road, I had to be real careful because there was 3 or 4 beautiful condors circling right over the pad where they were drilling, and which is sort of unusual because everybody said, oh, this oil field really disturbs the birds, you know, but they come in there and watch the drilling. Funny how they operate. But so I'm following these 4 or 5 condors circling right above the drilling unit. And so as I get closer and closer and I get up onto the pad, they're still above, this gentleman comes running at my truck. Ranger, Ranger. He said, my God, he says, look at those things up. They've been circling me now up here for hours. And he says, are they dangerous? And I, in real Okie accent, I happen to be from Oklahoma. And so I can have an Okie accent too. And so we were talking, and I said, no. I said, that's the California condor circling you right there. He said, oh my God, he said, I was so worried. Me and my partner up there in the tower, they're up top in this drilling operation. And he said, we were getting scared. And finally we came down. He said, we weren't going to stay up there because they were going to attack us. And I said, no, they don't attack. I said, they only eat carrion, dead stuff. And he said, well, he says, I know one thing, he said. When me and my partner were from Oklahoma City, and he said, we were saying to ourselves when we were up there and decided we were going to come down, those are the biggest chicken hawks we've ever seen in our life. And chicken hawk is a common term in Oklahoma, and I just laughed. I tell you, I spent a half hour with those 2 guys just talking about condors that day, and it was quite an experience. A funny story in the oil field. Wow, that was one of the first issues I saw when I came back to the Angeles as forest supervisor. I realized that we really have some issues with people being able to afford to live on the Angeles and in the cities around the Angeles. So I had struggled with it for some time, and one of the wives of one of our foremen came into my office and asked for a meeting with me. So my secretary called me and says, George, such and such would like to meet with you about something. I said, sure, bring her in. So she sat down and said, Mr. Roby, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but a lot of people in your district are on welfare. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. You know, I might have suspected it, but I didn't ever really come to my mind. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, we've been on welfare for a long time. We're barely making it here. And that's why I couldn't get any of my jobs filled, because the search would come in and no names, no name search. Nobody would apply. That was part of the reason, the cost of living. I said, boy, this is terrible. And I thanked her, and we talked for a long time. And so I started looking into how I might approach a cost of living allowance on our forest. And so when I became, so I couldn't do anything. Nobody would let me do anything. It was, no, you can't fight OPM, on and on. So when I became forest supervisor on the Angeles, again, several years later, after being in D.C., I started to decide, hearing this story again, and I started to do something about it. So I started asking questions, contacting OPM in Washington, what's the procedure to look into something like this, and I had a very, very efficient person in personnel. Her name was Debbie Rutherford, and I thank her to this day for that. And every time I see her, we talk about it. She was in my personnel staff, and we talked to her about it, and she was interested in helping me on this. I agree. I know there's a problem. If I can help in any way, let's do it. So, being a forest supervisor in Southern California, we had a board meeting every so often of the 4 southern national forests, and we call it the Board of Directors, Southern California Board of Directors. And I was the chair at one time there, and we had a meeting in San Bernardino, and I told them about the problem that I had with some of my employees and being on welfare. And they sort of ignored the issue and said, well, I don't think we have that problem on the San Bernardino or the Cleveland in San Diego. I don't think we have that problem. And the LP said, I don't think we have that problem. And I knew they did because I was on the LP, and Santa Barbara is one of the most expensive places in the world. So I said, are you guys serious? And I said, I think we ought to do a concerted effort for Southern California and try to get, I'm tired of these no-name certs. And they said, well, we are too. But so I said, are you in this with me or not? I've got personnel staff that's willing to work, and I'm sure you guys could help. And they said, no, George, we understand the situation, but it's a futile effort. You'll never make any headway with OPM. I think you might as well go on to something of a higher priority. And I says, there's no higher priority, so I'm going to do it myself without you guys. So I went home, sat down with Debbie Rutherford, and she started embarking on manuals and OPM booklets and things showing me what we had to do, if anything, if we could do anything. So I called OPM in Washington. Oh, before I did that, I called the regional forester and told him what I was up to. I said, hey, I want your support, because here's happened. The other forest supervisors, the other three in Southern California, have decided they don't want to put any effort on it because it's a futile attempt. But I want to continue it. I want your support. And so I flew to San Francisco, sat down with him, met with him, and told him the situation about people I have that were on welfare. These are engine captains on welfare. And he looked at me and he said, George, that was Paul Barker, was the forest supervisor, I was the regional forester at that time. And he said, George, you've got fire in your eyes on this, don't you? And I said, yep. And he said, I'll support you, but I think it's a futile effort. He said, I don't think you'll make any headway with OPM, but I'm behind you 100%. So I got an appointment with OPM in Washington and met with some people there and told them the story about this wife coming into my office when I was ranger, and said they couldn't believe the story that there's government employees on welfare. I said, you got to be kidding me. I think there's a lot of other places it's probably happening. You're just hearing about it now in our forest. And so she, the lady that was in charge of the group I met with, started getting interested and wanted more input, so I gave her more input that Debbie had put together for me. And they said, let us look into this a little bit and do a little research. I said, okay. I got an open ear in my mind. I knew, well, at least they're listening. And I was told I'd be shut down. So I go home. A few phone calls later, I'm talking to OPM, the lady that I'd met with, and she said, we're looking into this. You might have a case. And I said, well, I hope so. So in a couple more meetings back there with them, all of a sudden we were being considered. Nothing had been done, but we were going to be considered. So I had to write a bunch of justifications and give them case studies of people that we had, that, anonymous. And Debbie, of course, had to put a lot of this stuff together for me. And so finally, things started moving, but nothing happened. And then 6 months later, I'm still working on it back and forth with OPM, and I finally announced my retirement. And that's in 1990. And so at my retirement party, the regional forester, Paul Barker, the one that gave me the go to OPM and start justifying a cost of living increase on the Angeles, as he was giving me the regional plaque, the gift and saying goodbyes and all of that, and he got up and handed me the regional plaque. That's a traditional thing, and He said, "Oh, by the way, I have another thing here for you, George." And he opens this envelope, and it was a letter from OPM granting cost of living increase to the Angeles National Forest in LA County. And it also said San Diego County, Santa Barbara County, and I can't remember if San Bernardino was included then or not. But it grew, and all of a sudden we had the cost of living allowance to help people that were working on the forest and in the Southern California forest. And it finally grew to San Francisco area. And then San Francisco got a cost of living increase in the federal government. And so, and that was the day I retired, when the letter came to the regional forester announcing that they had allowed a cost of living increase for the Forest Service in the Angeles National Forest and Cleveland and San Bernardino, I think, at the time, and then the Los Padres. Later, it grew to this Bay Area in San Francisco. So I never benefited from it, but all of my people did. Well, when I was fire chief on the San Bernardino, FMO, fire chief, I was there for 3.5 years, and then I got hired to the Riverside Fire Laboratory to head up the Chaparral Research and Development Program, where we did research on the effects of fire in chaparral ecosystems or Mediterranean ecosystems. Everything between the 30th and 40th parallel is considered the Mediterranean ecosystem. So worldwide, between the 30th and 40th is similar ecosystems, and fire behaves very similarly, and the vegetation is very similar. So we did a lot of research. We pushed out in that project over 40 publications that were designed for the manager on the ground and not the scientific community. So it was very well received, and the work is still being used today. Well, after I finished that project, I got offered a job in Washington, D.C., working on the fire staff there for Al West. And I was in charge of the fire chemicals program, approval and disapproval of foam, gel, and retardants. And I also had the liaison with the Pentagon on the MAFS systems, the modular airborne firefighting systems that go into the C-130s for the military, and coordinated the training for all the liaison officers for that program. And then I was in charge of the RAWs and ALLs, remote automatic weather stations, and the automatic lightning detection program for the Forest Service. And after I was there 5 years, they offered me a promotion to the Angeles National Forest as Forest Supervisor. So that's how I wound up on the Angeles. Well, I retired there in 1990. That's when I planted my Smoky Bear and started grooming it in 1990. And started my own consulting business. So my consulting business is Arrowhead Wildfire 2000 Incorporated, and I'm the president and owner of that. And I've been consulting ever since. My biggest client has been the Phos-Chek, the fire retardant that you see coming out of the airplanes pretty much everywhere. The red stuff is the company that I consult with, and I've been consulting with them for 27 years. Had a few other clients in between. It was quite a change. The administrative headaches and red tape that I was with for many years as a Forest Service administrator, district ranger, and forest supervisor. It freed me of a lot of that. And when I started working on my own and doing my own thing and keeping my own schedule, I lost track of days even. I didn't know what was Monday or Tuesday or Saturday or what time of day it was, really. I just enjoyed doing the forestry consulting that I was doing, with mostly in fire. I consulted mostly in fire. That's what I specialized in my whole career, and that's what I do as a consultant. Well, after I retired and got a contract with Phos-Chek, they're a worldwide organization. They produce long-term retardants. They produce fire suppressant gels, and also Class A and Class B foam, and their market is worldwide. The big markets are United States is the biggest, Canada is second. Europe and Australia are probably close to number 3. And then South America, Chile is one of the big fire chemical countries in South America. And so I consulted with all those countries for Phos-Chek and taught them how to use the product, how to get the best effectiveness out of it, and how to get the best value for their dollar. And so they use me as a consultant to go around and train agencies, states. California is a large market for us, and they are probably stack up second to the Forest Service in number of gallons used, volumes used in the wildland firefighting arena. So the other states are Oregon, Washington, mostly in the West, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, but also across the whole United States, we have foam and gel sales. So it's a big job, and that's why I picked up another gentleman from the Forest Service many years ago, Ron Rayleigh, and he and I do the training around the United States and the world on how to use the product properly. When I was active in fire on the Forest Service, I used millions and millions of gallons of the product, so I knew them then and I understood them well, and I understand them even better today. The evolution of forest fire chemicals has been coming around for a long time, but it pretty well started in the 50s, where they started trying to get something more effective than water. Water is of course, the most used suppressant in the world, and it will always be probably. But as firefighters and fire managers on the ground saw the issues with managing wildfire, especially large ones, as they start getting beyond that initial attack and follow-up response, wildland fire managers saw a need to get something that would allow them to go indirect with fire chemicals. The only tool we had in the 50s and early 60s was tractor lines and hand lines going indirect, which is a very dangerous set of circumstances many times, and a lot of thought and understanding of fire behavior and knowledge of what you're doing is very important before you send tractors and crews indirect in unburned fuel. And so around the time that they were looking at the possibility of other chemicals that might allow that to happen, that started the first generation of fire retardants, long-term fire retardants. Suppressants rely on the presence of water, and no matter whether it's a gel, foam, or any other kind of suppressant. So once the water evaporates, there's no agent or effective agent there to affect the fire. So, and that happens through radiation or through solar energy, radiation from the fire or solar energy. And so they saw that some of these long-term retardant possibilities will last long-term, and they don't require the presence of water. So a long-term retardant, and the generations that have come from the late 50s to now have improved so much, but they do not require water. So the only reason they put water in retardant is to deliver it to the aircraft, deliver it to the vegetation, and suppress the fire. the water that they put in it has to evaporate before the chemical starts its chemical reaction. So you can lay a line a mile ahead of a fire, and it can dry, and it'll still be effective when the fire hits it. You can't do that with water. So what's happened is, by allowing the aerial attack to do the indirect attack now, you don't have to put people at risk out there in the unburned fuels, and the suppressants, the foams and gels, cannot do that for any length of time because the water evaporates so fast, especially in firefighting conditions. And so the effectiveness of the aerial application has completely gone out of sight as compared to what it was with water. So the focus now by many agencies, states, federal, counties, is to use long-term retardant for indirect attack. And so that's made the aerial resources much more effective than they were with plain water. Well, that's an interesting, the cellulose fuel that most all wildland fuels are around the world, are made up, a molecule of cellulose is C6H10O5. That's a molecule of cellulose. So when you use long-term retardant, when it's in contact with cellulose fuel and fire hits it, it changes the way cellulose fuels decomposes. And when cellulose fuels burn naturally, the products of combustion are methane, ethane, propane, butane. There's around 49 flammable components come off of cellulose when you burn it. In the presence of Phos-Chek, it stops that production of methane, propane. And what happens is it takes the CHs and Os in a molecule of cellulose and produces water and carbon. So it locks up the H2O and makes steam and cools, and then it changes the fuel type to C, which is carbon. And so that chemical reaction over a chain of events, as the fire burns into a retardant line, the cooling and the forming of carbon slows the progress of the fire down till it eventually stops. And so that's where the term retardant comes from, is it retards the fire, and until you can get a hand line in there or a tractor line or something to hold the fire permanently, that's the difference between water and long-term retardant, is it does not rely on the presence of water. It actually makes its own water when fire hits it. Out of cellulose. It comes out of the molecule of cellulose. So that's why it's so effective, and it can be for months. We've had treated homes down in San Diego County that were treated in May. The fire came through in October, and the treated homes were saved. That was many months later. So that's where the term long-term retardant comes from, because it's effective for long terms. Well, I had many occasions where that occurred. One that comes to my mind the most was an outlaw motorcycle group took over our campgrounds on the Los Padres National Forest when I was assistant ranger, resource officer. And our patrolman up there reports that we have AK-47s. They're throwing full beer cans at campers and people, normal campers. And they took over this campground and ran everyone out. And they reported the people that coming down the road would stop and go to a payphone and call and say, hey, we got a problem up there. And the patrolman who was in the area radioed us down and said, hey, we need the sheriff and everybody up here. We got a major a conflict going on. People are afraid for their lives, and so we had to go up and negotiate with this outlaw motorcycle gang in conjunction with the sheriff. And so we spent several hours there. We're looking at these weapons laying all over the picnic tables and targets all over the hillside where they had been target practicing. And with the help of one of the most effective sheriffs I have ever been with, he was a very good negotiator, and I was a relatively good negotiator. And we finally quieted this group down and slowly had them escorted. And we, of course, by that time we had a lot more law enforcement and that had come in to help the situation. So we escorted all of those outlaw bikers back to Ventura County, down into Ventura area in Oxnard. We listened, and we talked a lot, and we didn't do any threatening. We didn't do any, we're throwing you in jail. Where the technique had to be very, very touchy, and so it was basically a communication technique led by this sheriff that actually quieted the group down. They were all of them were drunk. They were all on drugs, bags of drugs all over the picnic tables. And they started listening, and no one pulled a gun out, and none of the sheriff did, none of our law enforcement people did, the Forest Service people. So it was basically just a negotiation without pressure, and knowing that it's a volatile situation. If anyone ever did make a wrong move, it was going to be a disaster. And even they started thinking that, I think, when they saw the backup forces we had behind us when the sheriff and the highway patrol and everyone got in there. So it was really just a major negotiation issue, and it turned out to be quite effective, but you didn't know that until the minute they started firing up their motorcycles and driving down the road. You didn't know. This would have been about 1973 on the Ojai district of the Los Padres. I would tell them that it's a very noble job to have, and it's not one they're going to get rich on. They're going to work hard. They're going to be away from their families a lot. They're going to love what they do. And if they don't, they'll find soon they're in the wrong profession. But I think it's probably one of the most satisfying jobs, and to be able to deal with the natural elements and the outdoors and dealing with people and all the different resources that are available from forested lands, brush lands, all lands are forested as far as I'm concerned, unless it's a city. So I think it's just like as I said, it's a very noble one to have, but you can't expect to get rich doing it. And if you expect to get big benefits, big monetary value out of it, why, it's not the job for you. But it is probably one of the most satisfying jobs that I ever had, working in forestry. I think one of the biggest impacts on forestry, but I'm going to pretty well limit my knowledge and comments to the U.S. Forest Service because that's where I come from, but I think it somewhat relates to the other forestry organization as well. I think the electronic world has completely handicapped many of the objectives and management objectives of fire managers and forestry managers. It's taken them away from the field. They're in front of a computer constantly. They can't get away from it. The system forces them to do it. And so as a result, you don't see the management on the ground. You don't see the management by wandering around anymore. The I used to say, and I got it from a guy I worked for in Washington D.C. You get panel vision sitting in the office, and the computer even forces that even more. So we were when we were doing it and getting in the field without the benefit of a computer, we would be asked to do a report, major report, and say, okay, you've got 3 or 4 weeks to put this together, so in the mail, regular mail, you'd get the request. Then a regular mail, you would send it back. So over a period of time, you had time to really deal in detail with some of these issues that we were dealing with. Now, because it's instantaneous communications, management wants what they're asking for tomorrow. They don't want it they don't give you 2 weeks to prepare and do all the good staff work it requires to make good decisions and recommendations. So before you know it, you're stuck with this immediate need to respond to an immediate request. And I think that's taken a lot of the quality out of what gets done that affects resource management in particular. The other thing that I think is a major issue is the budget reductions, which there's not a lot can be done about that, but there's other things that make it even worse, and that's these consolidations of national forests and districts, ranger districts. I think it's very appropriate in many, many instances, and it's been a good decision to do that. But in many of the decisions to consolidate ranger units, it just makes that job much bigger for fewer people. And then you add the electronic impact to that. It's just management's not being seen on the ground on national forests today in the West, as I saw it when I was district ranger and forest supervisor. So that's a major impact, and I think it's acting negatively on the Forest Service in particular. Well, I am really concerned about the future of forestry in California, especially with the Forest Service, because of the cutbacks, the lack of management I see in a lot of areas. They just don't have the resources to properly manage the land. I think budgets are the main reason. It's also national priorities that's coming around in the federal government. I don't see a big light at the end of the tunnel right now. The amount of people to manage the lands that I used to manage are much less than when I was there, and we were struggling to do a quality job. So I know the issues of today and the lack of personnel and budgets is even making that worse, and I'm concerned about it. In my opinion, healthy forests need attention, and they need to be harvested. They need to be managed properly during that harvest. They need to deal with insect and disease earlier in the stages that they occur. I think the challenges that face land managers in California in particular, and the Rockies are suffering the same thing, is their hands are tied due to environmental limitations and the requirements of government to manage the forest properly. And forests, in my opinion, need to be managed, and when they're managed, they're being harvested. Calling out the older trees, keeping the older overstories that need to be there for other purposes such as wildlife, and so it's a challenge that I think we're so far behind the curve now. It's going to be difficult to turn around. but we need to get back into a reasonable harvesting program in these forested lands to try to get them back in healthier condition, to allow them to provide the resources that this country needs, including recreation, watershed management, all the things that wildlife management that needs healthy forests. And we're not going to have healthy forests in the direction that we're going now. Well, I'm very concerned about it, and I think that there's a root cause to this, and one of them is the lack of timber activity on national forest lands. I think forest properly managed and harvesting timber on national forest lands in California in particular, in the Sierras, I think that's been a major disaster for us not to be able to continue a good management program in managing the timber. I think that when you get epidemics that are going on in the Sierras right now, it's beyond the point of no return, I'm afraid. But I think a well-managed timber program is something that California really needs, and it's been lacking for a long time. And as a result, you get these epidemics like we're seeing now that become unmanageable, and the resources to deal with it are less. The agencies don't have the resources to deal with it. I hope that they will get the resources to deal with it, but the San Bernardino had a similar thing take place that's going on in the Sierras right now, and that started back around the 2000, 2002. And the program they embarked on there is, I'm astonished at how effective it was in going in there and removing the affected trees and getting the healthy trees revived. And so that's a good example of what can be done. But the job in the Sierras now is so huge, it's such a huge area that's affected, that it's going to be a major undertaking to try to manage it and control it. Wow, that's a good question. Well, in my world, I would like to have a healthy forest with pockets of older, unhealthy forests that, for various reasons, for various wildlife habitat and things that they need to have. But overall, it should be a vigorous, growing, healthy stand with these other pockets that meet other needs. But we're so far away from that now due to the issues that we've dealt with over the last 20 years in the Forest Service in particular. It's affected other agencies too. It's going to be hard to get us there. It's going to be very hard to get back to healthy forests. When I fly California now in the Rockies, I just shake my head about where we are today compared to where we were 40, 50 years ago when I fly over that same route on an airplane, how nice and healthy it looked. And the forests actually looked healthier when they were being managed and harvested under a managed program. And that's what's lacking today, and I don't know that we'll ever see that come back. Well, I joined the SAF. I knew about the SAF before I ever went to college, but I went to Oregon State University, and I didn't have the money to join anything at the time. So I waited till I graduated, or my senior year actually, to when I knew I was going to get a job when I graduated, and then I joined the SAF at that time. The SAF was in my mind even before I had my degree, because I heard people when I was going to Oregon State, some of the foresters that I was going to school with were members of the SAF, so I knew about the organization, and I knew it had a lot to offer. And so I decided that I was going to join it as soon as I could afford joining it, and knew that I had a job coming in the future. So, so I saw the benefits even before I actually became a member, talking with other members. And so that led me to a profession that that I still practice today. And I recommend other foresters, to join the organization and participate in committees. And I participated in committees myself. I was active in Southern California a lot when I was first out of school. And then as I retired, I sort of didn't get as involved in all the different SAF activities as I used to. But I still participate and attend, and would recommend it highly for anyone in this profession to be a member of. Yes, I think the SAF has been a very, very viable organization as long as I've been involved, and I think it's got a tremendous future ahead of it. I think the biggest challenge is the environmental issues that everyone faces, and especially in the forestry industry. I think the thing that encourages me is we still see people wanting to become foresters, and I see it everywhere I go. These young people thinking like I remember when I was back when I was thinking about going to Oregon State University, and how excited they seem to be. We need to keep that excitement among our young people, and we need to do a better job in managing our forests. There's no doubt in my mind. So I think the relevance of SAF is going to get greater and not less. And I understand their numbers are falling, and that's not anything I like to hear or see, but I hope that's not true, the rumors I've been hearing. I think the numbers have to increase, and we have to make a bigger impact on the forested lands in the United States, and a positive impact. Right now, we're not, in my opinion, we're not doing a real good job in managing our forest resources in the Forest Service in particular. I am one of the luckiest people in the world. I met a woman on a blind date that became my wife in the San Fernando Valley, and we've been married for 50 years in February, which is not very far away. And after meeting on the blind date, I transferred a couple of times, moved around different stations. We stayed in contact. And when I was battalion chief on the Cleveland in the Descanso Ranger District, I proposed to her, and we decided to get married. And so that was almost 50 years ago. And we have two daughters, Regina, we call her Gina, and Tamara, and they both work for the Forest Service. Gina, our youngest, worked on an engine for 8 years here on the Angeles and 1 year on the Cleveland, and worked her way through college, getting her degree. She got her BS degree at Cal Poly Pomona in agriculture, and then got her MBA at the University of Laverne in Laverne, and then later got her credentials as a teacher. And during the time before she became a teacher, she worked for a year at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the Deep Space Program. And then decided she wanted to be a teacher. So she's teaching now in the Claremont schools right here where we live. It has been for 10 or 15 years, something like that. And Tammy works for the Forest Service today, still. She works at the Danny Rhines Training Center on the San Bernardino National Forest. They both married Forest Service chiefs. I had nothing to do with it. Tammy married Eric Martinez, and Gina married Randy Unkovich. And Randy used to work for me when I was forest supervisor on the Angeles, on the Dalton Hotshot crew. And Gina and Randy met when she was on the engine at Lower San Antonio here, just north of our house. And so many years later, they got married. And then Eric and Tammy got married, and Eric works for the Forest Service. He is a communication specialist on an incident command team, and also is the communication specialist for NEMO, the NEMO teams, helps them with their communication needs, and also he's the national coordinator for the Forest Service Honor Guard now. He's been doing it for years as other duties is assigned. Now, Tom Harbor hired him to take on the NEMO job and the Honor Guard in one job. So now he's actually working out of the Washington office, working out a virtual office here in Upland, California. So Forest Service is a big part of my life. Even today, I can't have dinner or beer with or a glass of wine without us talking Forest Service, because they are all Forest Service as well. So anyway, I want to say that my wife has been one of the most understanding people in the world to follow a career like I have, because I had and still have. The first crack out of the bag after we got married, I had told her that I'll be gone for lengthy times on fires and travel around the U.S. probably. And the first fire I get sent on after we got married, I go up to the Sundance Fire in Idaho, a major catastrophe fire that killed a person that I knew. And I was gone 3 weeks without being able to make a phone call, no cell phones, no radio, nothing, no way for me to communicate with my wife to tell me where I was, how I was doing. So finally, when I get home after 3 weeks, I meet her at the door, and we hugged for a long time, and she said, "Oh my God," she said, I didn't realize what you meant when you said you'd be gone at times and not be able to communicate at all like they can today. They talk daily on cell phones today. But in those days, we couldn't get to a phone, or we couldn't use a government phone to make a personal call, start with. And that's all the phones we had in fire camp. So we just didn't communicate for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, many times. And she made it through all this, which was a major support for me, because I couldn't have carried out my career without her backing and her support.